She's nothing but a disappointment." My mother said it without flinching. Right there in the courtroom, in front of the judge, in front of strangers, in front of me. She said it the way someone states a fact they've believed for so long it doesn't even feel cruel anymore. The judge set his pen down. He looked at my mother for a moment, then at me. Then he turned to my parents' attorney and asked a question so quiet the back row had to lean forward to hear it. "Counselor," he said, "are you aware of your opposing party's background?" The attorney hesitated. My father's jaw tightened, my mother blinked, and I just stood there, hands folded on the table in front of me, saying nothing. But that moment didn't happen overnight. It started 6 weeks earlier, when a phone call dragged me back to a place I hadn't seen in 7 years. I was living in Norfolk at the time. Small apartment near the hospital where I worked per diem shifts. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just come off a 12-hour stretch and was sitting on my couch with a plate of leftover pasta when my phone buzzed. The number had a 276 area code, Southwest Virginia. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did, because the voice on the other end belonged to Pastor Henley, a man I hadn't spoken to since I was 19 years old. "Bridget," he said gently, "I'm calling about your grandmother." I set my fork down. Grandma May had been the steady thing in my childhood, the woman who let me sleep on her couch when my parents' house felt like a war zone. The woman who packed me sandwiches when I left town at 20 with nothing but a duffel bag and $60 in my pocket. "She passed this morning," Pastor Henley said, peacefully in her sleep. I closed my eyes. The kitchen light hummed overhead. Outside, someone honked their horn in the parking lot below. The world kept moving, but mine had just stopped for a second. "There's something else," he continued. "She left a will. The house and the 2 acres behind it, she left them to you. I didn't say anything for a long time." "Bridget, you still there?" "Yes, sir," I said. "I'm here." I drove to Jessup County 3 days later. It took about 4 hours from Norfolk, mostly on 2-lane roads that wound through the mountains. The closer I got, the more familiar the trees looked, the way they crowded the road like walls. By the time I crossed the county line, the sun was low and orange, and everything smelled like wood smoke and damp leaves. Jessup County hasn't changed much since I left. Population around 4,000, maybe less. 1 stoplight. A post office that closes at noon. A gas station that sells live bait and breakfast biscuits from the same counter. I pulled into the gravel lot of Henderson's General Store and parked. Through the window, I could see Loretta Henderson restocking shelves. She was pushing 70 now, but still moved like a woman half her age. When I walked in, the bell above the door rang, and she looked up. Her expression shifted from polite to surprised in about half a second. "Well, I'll be," she said softly. "Bridget Kincaid. Hey, Miss Loretta." She came around the counter and studied me the way older women in small towns do. Not rude, just thorough, like she was cataloging every difference between the girl who left and the woman who came back. "Heard about May," she said. "I'm sorry, honey. She was good people. She was. You staying at her place?" "For now." Loretta poured me a cup of coffee from the pot behind the register and handed it to me without asking. It was bitter and strong, exactly how Grandma May used to make it. "Your folks know you're here?" she asked carefully. "I expect they will by sundown." She nodded like that answered every question she hadn't asked yet. I was right. By the next morning, they knew. My father's truck appeared in Grandma May's driveway around 10 o'clock. He didn't knock, he just stood by the porch steps with his arms crossed, waiting for me to come outside. My mother sat in the passenger seat with her window down, watching. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee. "Morning," I said. He didn't return it. "So it's true," he said. "You came back because Grandma May passed, and the house had nothing to do with it. She left it to me. I didn't ask for it." My mother leaned out the truck window. "You disappeared for 7 years, Bridget. 7 years. It's the second there's something worth having, you show up." I took a sip of coffee and said nothing. "Your father and I took care of her," my mother continued. "We drove her to appointments. We brought her groceries. We were here." "I know you were," I said. My father shook his head. "If you had any sense of what's right, you'd sign the deed over." I looked at him. His face was the same hard mask I remembered from every argument we'd ever had. Nothing behind it moved. "I'm not doing that," I said quietly. He stared at me for a few more seconds, then he turned, got back in the truck, and drove away without another word. My mother didn't look back. 4 days later, a deputy showed up at Grandma May's front door with a manila envelope. Court papers. My parents were contesting the will. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. I sat on the porch that evening, reading through the documents. The legal language was dense, but the accusation was simple. They were claiming my grandmother wasn't in her right mind when she signed the will, and that I had manipulated her from a distance. I set the papers down and looked out at the yard. The old magnolia tree Grandma May had planted the year I was born was still standing. Its leaves were going brown at the edges. She used to sit under it in her lawn chair and read paperback novels until the sun went down. I could almost see her there now. Inside the envelope, folded between the legal pages, I found something the attorney must not have known about. A handwritten note from my grandmother tucked into a small sealed envelope with my name on it. I opened it carefully. Her handwriting was shaky, but clear. Bridget, don't let them tell you who you are. You were always braver than they knew. Love, Grandma May. I folded it back up and put it in my jacket pocket close to my chest. Then I sat there until the sky turned dark, listening to the crickets and the wind moving through the pines. The 3 weeks before the hearing passed slowly. I spent most of the time working on the house. The gutters were clogged. The back steps had rotted through. The kitchen faucet dripped in a rhythm that would drive anyone crazy after 2 days. I fixed what I could with tools. Word travels fast in a place like Jessup County. By the end of the first week, half the town knew about the court case. People had opinions. Some of them shared those opinions to my face. Mr. Yancey from the hardware store stopped me in the parking lot one afternoon. "Your daddy's been talking," he said. "Says you walked out on the family and never looked back." "That's one way to tell it," I said. I smiled faintly. "That's a longer story, Mr. Yancey." He nodded like he understood, even though he probably didn't. A few days before the hearing, I ran into my parents' attorney outside the courthouse. His name was Dwight Pemberton. Tall, thin, silver hair combed back neatly. He had the kind of handshake that was firm on purpose, like he'd practiced it. "Miss Kincaid," he said, "I believe we'll be seeing each other soon. Looks that way." He studied me for a moment. "My clients have authorized me to offer a settlement. Sign the property over, and we avoid the unpleasantness of a public hearing." "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'll be in court." His smile tightened. "You're representing yourself. I understand." "Yes." He tilted his head slightly. "That's an unusual choice. I've made a few of those." He adjusted his tie and walked away. I watched him go and thought about all the people who had underestimated me over the years. The list was long. It didn't bother me anymore. The morning of the hearing was cold and gray. Early November in the mountains. The kind of morning where your breath hangs in the air and the frost on the grass crunches under your shoes. I put on the only good blazer I owned and drove to the courthouse. It was an old brick building at the center of town, 2 stories, with a flagpole out front that leaned slightly to the left. Inside, the hallway smelled like floor wax and old wood. A few people from town had come to watch. Not many, maybe 15 or 20, but in Jessup County, that's a crowd. My parents were already seated at the front table when I walked in. My mother wore a dark blue dress. My father had on a sport coat I recognized from years ago. He'd probably had it since the 90s. Their attorney sat beside them, papers arranged neatly in front of him. I took my seat at the opposite table. No attorney. Just a folder of documents and a bottle of water I'd brought from home. Dwight Pemberton glanced at me and raised an eyebrow slightly. I didn't react. The bailiff called the room to order. A side door opened, and the judge walked in. His name was Judge Carlton Birch. Lates, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck, he sat down slowly, opened a folder, and looked at both tables over the rim of his glasses. "All right," he said. "Let's get started." Pemberton stood first. He buttoned his jacket and approached the benches like a man who had done this 100 times. "Your Honor," he began, "my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Kincaid, are lifelong residents of this county. They cared for the decedent Mrs. May Kincaid during the final years of her life. They drove her to medical appointments. They maintained her home. They were present." He paused for effect. "The defendant, Their daughter has been absent from this family for the better part of a decade. She did not attend holidays, she did not visit, she did not call, and yet the will in question leaves the entirety of Mrs. Kincaid's property, the home and surrounding land, to her. He turned slightly toward the gallery. We believe this will was executed under undue influence. At the very least, it does not reflect the reality of who was truly there for Mrs. Kincaid. Judge Birch wrote something on his notepad. "Mrs. Kincaid," he said, looking at my mother, "would you like to speak?" My mother stood. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady. "Yes, Your Honor." She smoothed the front of her dress. "I want the court to understand what it was like," she said. "Raising a daughter who wanted nothing to do with her own family, who thought she was too good for this town, who packed up and left without so much as a goodbye." She turned her head slightly in my direction, though she didn't look at me directly. "We gave her everything we could," my mother continued, "and she threw it away. She didn't finish school. She didn't build anything. She just disappeared." Then she said it, the sentence that hung in the air like something breakable. "She's nothing but a disappointment." The courtroom went quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet. The kind where people stop breathing for a second because they can't believe what they just heard a mother say about her own child in public. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I kept my eyes on the judge. Somewhere behind me, a woman whispered to the person beside her. I couldn't hear what she said, but I could feel the shift in the room. Judge Birch removed his glasses and set them on the desk. He looked at my mother for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Miss Kincaid," he said, "you may respond." I stood up. My chair scraped the floor lightly. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, "my grandmother and I had a relationship that existed mostly through letters and phone calls. It wasn't perfect, but it was real." I opened my folder and pulled out a small stack of documents. I have copies of letters she wrote me over the years. I also have records of money orders I sent her. For groceries, for property taxes, for a new water heater 2 winters ago. Pemberton shifted in his seat. I continued. "I didn't come back to Jessup County for the house. I came back because my grandmother was the one person in my family who never made me feel like I had to earn the right to exist." I handed the documents to the clerk. Judge Birch began reading through them. The room was still. My father stared at the table. My mother's lips were pressed together tightly. The judge paused on one page. He read it twice. Then he looked up, not at the documents, but at me. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight narrowing of the eyes, like he was recalculating something. He set the page down and turned to Pemberton. "Counselor," he said slowly, "are you aware of your opposing party's background?" Pemberton blinked. "I'm sorry, Your Honor." "Her background," the judge repeated, "beyond what your clients have described. My understanding is that she left home at 20 and has had limited contact with the family since then." "That's what your clients told you," Judge Birch said. "That's not what I asked." The room went dead quiet. My mother leaned forward. My father uncrossed his arms. The judge picked up the page again and held it so Pemberton could see. "It was my DD-2 feen, the document the military gives you when your service ends. It lists everything: branch rank, deployments, awards." Pemberton leaned in. His eyes moved across the page. Then he went still. "I was not aware of this," he said. Judge Birch nodded. Clearly. He turned toward the courtroom. "For the record," he said, "Miss Kincaid served 6 years in the United States Navy as a hospital corpsman." He paused. "For those unfamiliar, a hospital corpsman is the medical personnel who deploys alongside Marines in combat zones. They are often the first responder when someone is wounded in the field." The words settled over the room like a weight. A man near the backs sat up straighter in his chair. An older woman covered her mouth with her hand. My father turned and looked at me, not with anger, with something closer to shock. "She completed 3 overseas deployments," the judge continued, "including strength theater operations, and received a Navy and Berber Achievement for actions under pressure during a mass casualty event." My mother's face drained of color. "That's not possible," she whispered. "She never told us that." Judge Birch looked at her over his glasses. "Did you ever ask?" Nobody answered. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands gripped the edge of the table. You were in the Navy, he said, his voice rough. I nodded. Yes, 6 years? Yes. My mother shook her head slowly. Why didn't you tell us? I kept my voice even. Because the last thing you said to me before I left was that I'd never amount to anything. I didn't think you wanted to know. That sentence landed harder than anything else said that morning. My mother sat back in her chair like the air had gone out of her. Pemberton tried to recover. Your Honor, he said, while this is certainly admirable, I fail to see how military service affects the matter of the estate. Judge Birch raised a hand. You're right, he said. Service alone doesn't determine inheritance. But when someone's character is being called into question in my courtroom, when a mother calls her own daughter nothing but a disappointment, I believe context matters. He looked at the documents again. The will is clear and properly executed. Mrs. May Kincaid left her property to her granddaughter. The evidence of undue influence is non-existent. The claim is based entirely on resentment, not on law. He paused. This court upholds the will as written. The gavel came down once, quiet and final. Behind me, someone exhaled. An older man near the aisle nodded slowly in my direction. He was wearing a faded cap that read USS Forrestal. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. The courtroom began to empty, chairs scraped, voices murmured. People filed out in small clusters, glancing back at my parents as they passed. I stayed in my seat and gathered my papers slowly. Across the aisle, my parents hadn't moved. Pemberton said something to them in a low voice, then picked up his briefcase and left. The door closed behind him, and then it was just the three of us. My mother sat with her purse in her lap, staring at nothing. My father rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he didn't know what to do. I stood up and tucked my folder under my arm. The instinct to walk out was strong. I'd done it before. 7 years ago, I walked out that same kind of door and didn't look back, but something held me there this time. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way my father's shoulders had dropped. Maybe it was Grandma May's note in my jacket pocket, pressing against my chest. My father spoke first. A corpsman, he said. Not a question, a realization. Yes, you were in combat zones. Yes. Some of them. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger, and in a way he was, because the daughter he remembered was a 20-year-old girl who left town in an old Honda with no plan and no money. The woman standing in front of him now was someone he'd never taken the time to know. My mother's voice was small when she finally spoke. Were you ever hurt? A few times, I said. Nothing permanent. Her eyes filled with tears. She didn't wipe them, she just let them sit there like she'd forgotten how to hide what she was feeling. We didn't know, she said. I know. Why didn't you reach out? I thought about that for a moment. Because every time I tried to imagine calling home, I heard the same thing, that I was wasting my life, that I'd never be enough. After a while, I stopped imagining it. My father looked at the floor. That's on us, he said quietly. The courtroom clock ticked on the wall. This whole thing was a mistake, my father said. The lawyers, the hearing, all of it. My mother nodded slowly. I was angry, she said. I thought you left because you didn't love us. I left because I needed to find out who I was, I said. And I couldn't do that here. My father cleared his throat. And who are you now? I almost smiled. Someone who knows how to stitch a wound in the dark, fix a broken porch, and forgive people who aren't ready to ask for it. He nodded once. That landed. I could see it in the way his eyes softened for just a second before he looked away. We walked out of the courthouse together. The November air hit us like a wall. My mother pulled her coat tighter. My father squinted at the gray sky. Supposed to snow this weekend, he said. That's what they're saying. He looked over at my grandmother's house in the distance, past the stoplight and the post office and the gas station. That roof's going to be a problem when the snow hits, he said. I know. I've been patching what I can. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've got a ladder that's taller than the one in May's shed, and I still remember how to lay shingles. I studied his face. He wasn't trying to take over. He wasn't trying to control the situation. He was trying to show up the only way he knew how, with his hands. I'd appreciate that, I said. My mother clutched her purse strap. Maybe I could come by too, she said. Bring something for lunch. You're welcome to. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. Nobody hugged, nobody cried. It was just three people standing on courthouse steps, deciding that maybe the distance between them didn't have to be permanent. That Sunday, my father's truck pulled into the driveway at Grandma May's house around 9 in the morning. He had the ladder strapped to the roof and a toolbox in the bed. My mother sat in the passenger seat holding a casserole dish covered in foil. Some things are inherited whether you want them to be or not. We worked most of the morning. My father and I replaced shingles while my mother swept the porch and wiped down the kitchen. For the first hour, we barely talked. Just the sound of hammers and the wind through the trees. Then my father handed me a nail and said, 6 years is a long time. It is. You must have seen things. I did. He didn't push. He just nodded and went back to hammering. That was enough for noon. My mother called us in lunch. For lunch we sat at Grandma May's kitchen table, the same table where she used to play cards with me on rainy afternoons. My mother set down plates and poured sweet tea from a pitcher she'd brought from home. We ate in silence for a while. Bridget, she said. I looked up. Her eyes were red. I shouldn't have said what I said. In court, in front of all those people. She swallowed. You are not a disappointment. My father nodded beside her. We were wrong, he said, about a lot of things. I sat there for a moment, letting the words settle. You were scared, I said. When I left, you were scared. My mother nodded. I thought I'd lost you forever. You almost did. The honesty in that sentence made all three of us go quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like ground clearing, not comfortable but necessary. I didn't leave because you failed me, I said. I left because I needed to breathe, and the only way I knew how to do that was to go somewhere nobody had already decided who I was. My father leaned back in his chair. That takes guts, he said. Coming from him, that meant everything. After lunch, we sat on the porch. The magnolia tree was bare now, its branches reaching up into the gray sky like open hands. My mother wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. My father leaned against the railing and looked out at the field. May always said you'd come back, he said. She told me once that girl's going to surprise all of you someday. I thought she was just being sentimental. He shook his head slowly. No, she wasn't. Before they left that afternoon, my father paused by his truck. Next Sunday, he said. Next Sunday. My mother waved from the passenger seat. A small wave, the kind you give when you're not sure if it's welcome, but you offer it. Anyway, I waved back. Then I stood in the driveway and watched the truck disappear down the gravel road, taillights glowing red in the fading afternoon light. The house behind me creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere in the kitchen, the faucet I'd finally fixed was silent for the first time in years. I put my hands in my jacket pockets and felt the edge of Grandma May's note against my fingers. Don't let them tell you who you are. I never did. And if you're hearing this story and it reminds you of someone, a daughter, a son, a sibling you stopped calling years ago, maybe it's worth remembering that the people who leave aren't always running away from you. Sometimes they're running toward the person they were always meant to become. And sometimes, if you're willing to ask instead of assume, you'll find out they became someone extraordinary while you weren't looking.